Okay, I want to make this as informal as possible. So don't be afraid to just yell out a question, and that'll kind of help me explain the whole system and kind of the motives behind it and all that, because I'm not going to defend anything that I do up here. This first slide, 3 years of mistakes. I'm relatively a new farmer. I've always been on the farm, but from the circumstances of losing my father, I was kind of put in the position to replace him 7 years ago. So all of these experiments are a way for me to learn. I have this idea that even though I got a few gray hairs, I'm still a relatively young farmer, and I'm just trying to absorb as much information as possible. And when all this had happened, I was kind of looking at if you know Ag PhD, the Hefty brothers, I was YouTubing all those videos, and I got into this regenerative farming kind of clique, and it makes a lot more sense to me. So please, any questions that you have, just interject. And I'm just going to explain this in a lot of different angles. I'm going to kind of mostly go like an economist. And the first thought process here, and I might resource Jonathan, he's an econ professor a little bit. Talk about normal goods and inferior goods. You know, with normal goods, as income comes up, demand increases. Inferior goods, you know, if you lost your job, you're probably not going to go buy or have a steak dinner with an old fashioned that's going to cost you $100. You're probably going to get rice and beans. And I've been trying to find these phenomenons and ways that we can utilize these really either cheap things that don't cost anything or extremely a lot less cost to replace the jobs or benefits of buying that normal good. So our farm started a hog barn. We've always had hogs, but we went into this confined feeding operation deal in 1997. I was a sophomore in high school, and we built 4 barns now. So we have a little microclimate, if you will, in the area of a lot of hogs. And as you go east, you get into chickens. We've got a lot of manure, and that has manifested over the years to where we have just abundance of nutrients, too much. We need to start sharing it. So this system that I'm going to talk about initially with the wheat and soybeans, in my mind, is a way to maybe share that resource with our neighbors, getting better value for those nutrients. So I want to show you one video here, and this is just an old Periscope video on Twitter. But
all right, let's go.
My boys this is a couple summers ago.
Okay, we're still producing ears, believe it or not.
And all my experiments started at a really small scale, and we kind of learned from that.
That's high sticking. Keep your hoe down. All right, quick count, all ready?
No.
Okay, let's start up top. 1, 2, count with me.
1,
2, 3, 4,
5,
5. There's one there. 6,
7,
7.
8.
There's an 8.
So I'll expedite this up a little bit.
9.
The experiment was to get a sense of how much a plant will compensate when we give it unlimited sunshine. So this corn plant was basically just dug up from the field 50 feet away from it when it just came out of the ground, put in the soil, and instead of producing 1 ear, that plant produced 31 ears.
21, 22, 23.
Because that plant had nothing blocking it, it completely changed its structure and physiological nature. And what happened initially, it recognized the space and it started sucker plants to the side. Each node produced an ear all the way down to the roots. And because that plant could recognize that sunshine, the ears actually started growing leaves on them to get more energy. So multiple ears started coming out on the same node. And you know, the tassel came out around the 1st of July. This plant was in reproduction mode for almost 2 months. It was amazing. I kept making these videos thinking, okay, we've got 6 years, that's what it's going to do. Okay, we've got 13, and then we got all the way to 31. We got 12 years with kernels. So, of course, we're going to run out of the male donor, if you will, in this scenario. But that just kind of opens your eyes to how we can perhaps maybe empower these plants through spacing and our nutrients. So the other part of it, that boy right there was potty training, so that was a good target for him every day, and that was some good old nature's best. So I had talked earlier about my transition from sales to landscaping. I always wanted to farm, and the landscaping was a way that I could just get lost in the agronomy. And I did not advertise. It was all a word of mouth, and I just wanted to make places look fantastic. And we got working with all these nice businesses and wealthier people in the community, and I really like putting out flowers. And this is what really opened my eyes to timing and spacing and sun capture and heights. You look at that space right there. We had tulips, we had crocuses before, we had pansies, we took them out. We plant the summer plants inside the pansies. We can use some thermal equity there for frost protection. We've got cannas in the back, so you've got different heights to shade the foliage, and you can make all these different arrangements. And it was cheap. These bulbs we could buy in bulk. We could plant these 64 plants we could buy for $7 at a wholesaler. So I was using some of this thermal equity, shading, all this stuff to really reduce our cost. And it really didn't make much sense to me when I was transported out of that mindset to the farm and seeing just all this bare dirt. A buddy of mine was getting married, and it was one of his first couple springs I was farming. It was about Memorial Day, so almost the 1st of June. And we went up skydiving. I would not have done it if I wasn't just dead dog tired from planting, but I thought, I'll make it. And I'm just jumping out of the airplane, and we're in western Indiana, and there's just nothing. We're almost the summer solstice, and we have this vast amount of soil that's just uncovered, not capturing any nutrients. And these farmers have to defend that area either through tillage or herbicide, to make room for their cash crop. So I see shapes, I see angles. The other thing that I still hold on to is a snow management company, and a big way of reducing costs is to really get a feel for the weather. You really see solar angles and how it warms up pavement in areas, and how that kind of transitions to how we can use less salt here, and you get a feel for all this. And we don't have this mindset when we're just doing what you see on the left. Now both of I guess these are monocrops, but you can see the different shape of sun capture here. On the left, that's probably 6 or 7 inch seeded wheat, and we're capturing sun in a linear fashion. Where in nature do you ever drive by that captures sun linearly, just straight line? Nothing. I mean, you've got up top, you've got the floor, and you've got everything in between. So this shape on the right is really intriguing. And I've just kind of started looking at this. I always talked about half pie, but then I started looking at phi and sunflowers, and it doesn't matter if it's a sunflower, if it's a hurricane, if it's our galaxy. There's this nature's code that's figured out this way to make things not only survive, but thrive. And I just saw a study a couple weeks ago that's really intriguing about the sunflower. So not only does it produce its seeds in this pattern that maximizes the amount that it can put in a specific space, but they did a study where they kept these sunflower seeds that are in the same exact head. So they called it kin or a family, and they planted those the next year. And that plant could communicate and know that each one of those plants were its relation, and it would contort its leaves to maximize the sun capture for the whole community. And that really got me thinking when we look at these, that plants, if they're different species, they're going to be somewhat competitors. But probably the number one way to maximize our return on investment from a time and space perspective is to empower each individual seed to make the most of its environment, like the corn. So I've went into this intercropping where we're layering cash and cover crops, going back to that flower mentality, that are going to decide their reproduction output in different time periods throughout the growing season. So that's a good way to utilize our abundance of manure. If we can actually capture that with a cash and cover crop, initially we can actually store it. So one saying from Brian Hefty is, if you smell it, it's not the smell of money, it's the smell of lost money. So we're putting the application together with seed application and trying to set up these dominoes that'll kind of work with a lot lower inputs and kind of work through a timing process. So this is, we'll kind of go through the progression of the lessons that I've learned in the last 3 years eventually. But this is dragline manure, about 10 pounds of radishes, and about a 1/3 rate of wheat. So we can really cut our rates on the cash crop when we widen the space of the rows and empower that plant multiplication. And the idea here is we're using offense as our best defense. We're looking for a cover crop that has a very large surface area of leaf that's going to take that ammonium and nitrogen and be able to outcompete its competitors, or like a purple henbit or henbit, or the winter annuals that we have pressured in our area. So the drag line is, we do not own the drag line. There's a lot of custom applicators, and they will come out with a big engine and pump it out of our barns, and it directly goes to our field. So they have up to 3 miles of hose, and we don't have to put it on the road. They're just directly pumping 1,500 gallons per minute to the field. So they really can get it down. We really like to get away. It's real. What's that? We're not broadcasting, we're injecting it through a coulter. Yeah, 18-inch spacing, and they go on an angle. But the problem that's manifested as we went from 1 barn to 2 barns to 3 barns to 4 barns, we're funneling in 3, 4, 5,000 acres of everybody else's grain to feed this hog operation, and we're not putting it back on 3,000 or 4,000 acres. So your fertility rises. So the drag line is fantastic logistically, but it's pretty short-sighted because you're adding nutrients that are irrelevant to the plant. I would argue that we won't need phosphorus for the rest of our life, my kids' life, and their kids' life. So it just becomes a snowden. Exactly. Starts tying up zinc, more acid, it requires a lot of lime, and it needs shared. Exactly. And that's what I'll get into is that whole mindset of leveraging somebody else's asset. What Jonathan was talking about with the Airbnb business model, we no longer own our pigs, so we're getting all of this resources brought to us basically for free. Why aren't we making the most of this nutrition through kind of this domino effect? But there's a lot of problems with that when you start putting it on the highway liability and all this stuff. So we're looking at a lot of different avenues for that. We'll come back to this picture. This is kind of the reverse of the wheat and cover crop idea. This is pearl millet planted with manure injection and wide row corn, and we empowered both crops and got a quick canopy closure there to outcompete weeds. About 150. We took a yield hit on purpose. We went 86 day. We're normally 115 day. So we sped up harvest thinking we could get enough sunshine to graze it, rotational graze it. We had a lot of tough things happen this fall from a family perspective and weather. We had a hurricane come up, dumped 9 inches of rain right after that. And because this wasn't a really long pasture, the compaction was just going to kill us, so we actually bailed it off. But agronomically, it worked pretty well.
So your plant space, you say wide. What's normally what do you do?
We are on 20-inch rows. Most people are in 30-inch rows in our area as far as corn. And a lot of the observation, we'll get into another term, just elasticity of crop flex. I'm all about this solar corridor like this picture. And I really like to do these experiments without RTK because I get all these little different experiments where we went wide on a guest row and all that kind of stuff. And it's so important as you go from 30 to 36 to 40 to 60, if you're empowering that plant and you're shutting off the solar corridor, then whatever you're growing in between there is going to shut down. And it's either going to die or it's just going to go dormant. So we've had to widen these rows and change the timing to empower both plants and find an ancillary benefits. Our regular commercial corn is 20-inch rows. We're in 20s on most of our corn. These experiments are out to 60. We've got a Kinsey finger pickup. The highest I could pump it out was 68,000, which made it about 22,000. And that's part of the problem as you widen the rows. Everyone tries to get the same seed population in those 60-inch rows, and if the corn plant does not come up like within 12 or 24 hours of each other, they become weeds, and it's really tough to push those same populations because you're getting plants every 2 inches. And a lot of this stuff we're reducing or keeping the same row population and omitting rows, or even lowering the row population, just to completely bottom out the prices, those inferior goods. The corn around that was in the 230, 240, 250 range, but it was, we harvested it 5 weeks later. And then we got a pretty big value on the biomass of that cover crop in between. If we would have managed it right, then we would have been able to rotational graze. We were just trying to, logistically get it out of the way and get my fence in there before we got busy with our other parts, and then have this big time period of 8 or 10 weeks of a lot of warm weather still left in our season. So if we grazed it, we'd have some regrowth, and then I was actually going to plant another crop into that. So it's just, I really like to get really diversified because our labor's scarce, so we try to find time windows to manage some of these projects, and maturity is one of the easiest ways to do that.
Have you ever come across a situation where, say, a storm that comes, blows something over, and so basically now you're screwed on both fronts as far as
As far as it falling down and running the whole relay deal, that's another big issue as we move on to this page here with the plant multiplication. When you severely lower that plant population, you get a much more robust structurally plant. So you got a much bigger root mass per plant. It's shorter. It doesn't need new light vertically. It goes outwardly. So you're just basically making a Gary Coleman, You're turning these plants into a different animal. And that's where this empowerment goes. So you got two different crops here. If we just talk about this wheat and soybeans first off, it's really important to me that we get this part of it done, because the wider rows is actually going to make each tiller produce grain. If I make it tiller with all this upfront fertility and I'm in shorter rows, then those tillers cannot get to the top sun capture area, so it actually turns into thatch, and you get more disease pressure, and it's actually basically robs energy. So putting this in 37 and now up to 60-inch rows, each one of these leaves grabs enough sun to trigger a grain head to get going. So we're seeing it'll drive people nuts if you get away from precision, but if a wheat plant is, say, 5 inches apart from another wheat plant, that one might make 47 wheat heads, and if one's right next to it, might make 12, but they're all going to compensate for their environment. So the bottom line is we can grow wheat for a net negative compared to that drag line. If the drag line guy comes out, he charges a penny a gallon. So if I have high phosphorus, high potash ground, all these nutrients, he can only drive so fast, so I'm paying him $50 an acre to custom apply to a field that does not need those nutrients. So by taking out these row units and driving really fast with our applicator, we're bumping that rate down. We're trying to get it lower and lower to 20, 30%, maybe even 10%, getting the heat off of it for plant multiplication and lowering it. We don't need to bring up, because we can leverage that ambient fertility level. But looking at that soybean, and we go back to those solar angles and phi, if you look at this picture, we're not blocking those solar angles to the soybeans. And I really like this schematic, and I may butcher all the ratios of phi, but it's 1 plus 1 is plus 2, and each number is the previous, and it makes this ratio of 1.618. And it doesn't matter if it's the dog's whiskers, the cat's whiskers, an open oak tree. Everything in nature is going to build an architecture of relativity. So all those tillers, if you see down low, are out capturing light. The center of the row is competing with each other for light. So you make a taller center, and you make this half a circle. So that widening in half a circle increases the surface area and empowers that space. It's all time and space. That wheat, we normally don't have wheat in our latitude. It is just placed there to grow in the fall, to start photosynthesis in February, to get more spring tillers, and then manage our water, manage our weed control, and then we get into this pruning play that I'm really excited about. So that schematic not only is blocking, but there's having that 20-inch row twin between the 60, there's always new light inside that soybean row that's going to make those branches even lower. And it's really cool on these soybean plants. A lot of this architecture initially is really going to set your yield later. We have this fascination with planting our soybeans 160, 180,000, but you end up getting a plant that has one single stem and nodes that are really far apart. If we can trigger 3, 4, 5, 6 branches, get 22, 24 nodes instead of 14, and get 12, 14, 16 nodes on each branch, then we have this amazing force multiplier on our soybeans that every good event, every happy day is going to produce so much more. And it's just compound interest. So we're basically leveraging plant flex in 2 different crops in 2 different seasons and trying to plug cover crops in there. And then we also want to start getting our livestock in there and maybe them do some of the jobs as well. So the other, did several projects this past year. This was soybeans growing in corn. The thought process was we probably can get more revenue out of the corn than the wheat. We just didn't know how negative effect would be on the soybeans. And they end up getting pretty leggy. And I'll get into this later, but I think there's a really cool way that we can revisit that for next year. And that's the next slide. And this guy is from Virginia. He calls it the 100-100 system. And I think it would apply with a lot of intercrops. It's the idea of, instead of having rows and blocking those solar angles, instead have clumps of plants that are staggered in nature and empower, just like that 31-eared plant, empower every direction around that taller plant. So then we can trigger multiple ears on each plant, really discover how much that male donor can produce, and take a $250 bag of corn, elite genetics, and plant 4,000 instead of 40,000, and get that seed cost of the corn down to $12. And maybe we just integrate a skip on a seed disc and squirt our starter right there, get enough to get it with a competitive advantage, and then it can feed off of the legume, producing nitrogen, taking care of your weeds. And maybe we also layer this with really tall ryegrass or something like that we can pin down. And I mean, the options are unlimited. But the whole idea here is, when we go back to that original picture with a linear sun capture, it's just like I-80 or I-70 through Kansas to Denver. It's a straight line. How long, you might be in, down in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and the crow flies 3 miles, and you got to drive an hour up and down the hill and sideways, and that's what I want to do with the sun capture. We're just maximizing through shapes and competition and spacing the amount of sun that we're capturing. So it's not only shapes, but it's showing up to work every day. Finding plants that will overwinter or nutrient cycle or what else. So my biggest passion is those people right there. I just had a lot of things happen in my life that have put a lot of perspective towards it. And I just want to love my wife and love my kids, and we just try to have fun every day. And these things that we do in our fields are a great excuse to go out there with the kids and the dog and sometimes my wife and check it out on a daily basis. I've been sharing it on social media, and I found that the more that I share, the more other people share, and it's a pretty good relationship. We had a field day, first annual Constant Canopy field day, and we actually harvested this relay crop live in front of several people from out of state and up in Canada, and had the kids out there. It was pretty neat. And you're all invited to the second Constant Canopy field day here next June. There's my marketing team for Pioneer Seeds. And I love to golf. I built a golf course at my house, a synergistic golf course, 3 greens, and the goal is, I can play a round of golf with 2 balls in about 30 minutes, but I want these 2 kids to just battle it out and talk trash, and maybe that'll be their college fund. I don't know, but it's just a good excuse to get out of the house. So you can really put down corn. And this is what happened when you have all these pigs putting down corn. If you look at some of these numbers, if you can see them, you've got your P1 and your potash, or base saturation of K. We're just loaded with fertility, and it's just to the point. Gabe Brown was saying maybe 1 application of phosphorus or potassium is probably going to be enough for the rest of your lifetime if you get the biology going. We focus on these 6 or 8 inch cores and these acids to burn out the soluble nutrients, but we have millions of pounds of soil that's our bank. If we can get those roots and that biology working, you've got 3 or 4 feet of topsoil, just way beyond these numbers. But we're so fascinated with these numbers. But this is really a big problem when you look at the algae blooms with the dead zone down to the Gulf of Mexico. Is just this mismanagement of nutrients, because we just want to get this job done of applying manure. And I saw this in 2016. If you remember that picture with the cover crops, this was the same field. This was just monocrop wheat. So the cover crops actually shared that nitrogen with the wheat and really diluted its ability to share those nutrients. With the monocrop, we just got excessive growth right above those injection points. So a way to really cut both the seeding rate, both the logistical cost, and our manure rate was to actually put those 2 processes together and put that seeder on the manure tank. And this is the spring of 2017. That plot right there is the relay plot. We had 17 varieties of soybeans interseeded in there to figure out the maturity relationship. But you can see the color difference where we made those strips. It was pretty incredible. And that's the plant that it's produced. So the outside of that is just normal management. We had a little bit of AMS there, 7.5 inch spacing. You see that main stem? That's probably the only stem that's going to produce a grain head. So we're seeding at 1.6, 2 million seeds, giving 1 head per seed, maybe 2 on some of them. This guy right here, 25, 30 grain heads from 1 seed. So I think the value, not only when you think regeneration and all these, replacing inputs, I think a lot of it's going to be in combined things, doing multiple jobs in one pass. Because when you think about seeding this wheat with the manure tank, if I can do it one pass, I'm replacing the drill pass, I'm replacing the dragline cost, and you start stacking these costs that you're replacing and make it pretty cheap. So there's bogey, a couple months apart there, but you can see the vigor of each crop, and I thought I was really in a pickle. We kept getting rains. I had my field day scheduled for that Wednesday, and that Wednesday we got about two inches of rain, and my soybeans were at that point 8 inches above the wheat, and I thought, how are we going to dry this wheat out? So I moved it to Friday, and we got it done, but it was pretty intimidating. And what was really neat is I talked about this shape of the wheat. So we have this enormous bush, and because we empowered those soybeans, there's this timing effect to where the wheat dies, or it starts to mature, so it loses part of its vigor. The soybeans are growing, and the soybean will actually push the wheat out of the way and start consuming the light. So I had all this grain down there, and I had to get it somehow. And this is what's really, really neat. I'm gonna come back to this picture here. We'll get into kind of the road here, the beginning of the 3 years of mistakes. And the first year was twin 30-inch wheat. And the wheat was fantastic, but we didn't have that shared sun aspect. So I didn't have the equipment. I broadcast about 300,000 bean seeds, thinking if I got half of them, I would have a decent bean crop. But the wheat ended up making about 120, and as you can see, there's just no sun left. So that goes to that theory. If you want to empower multiple things, whether it's multiple crops, whether it's livestock integration, you've got to change the initial crop specifically to get to your goals. So we had to widen that. This was the soybeans afterwards. We got really dry, and because they weren't actually seeded, they were broadcast, we had some problems with the drought stress, and we ended up getting rains, and the beans made about 40. But there were areas where I had ran over the wheat, and there was more light, and I wanted to change the game plan for next year, and that's where you see this picture here. That's Elf on the Shelf. That's our favorite discipliner for our kids. He's always watching and going back for Santa every night, But we moved the wheat to 37.5-inch rows to kind of come up with a compromise, and we had a fantastic cover crop stand that year. We had a warm fall, and it did a fantastic job. It was just completely clean the next spring, and I actually cross-planted our beans that year. I was thinking about making a planter, and we got really hot and dry in February, and I thought, well, let's just put them in the ground next time we get an opportunity. So mid-March, we had fantastic soil conditions. We took our 60-foot planter and actually planted it crossways into this wheat. And until the wheat gets about this tall, it can recover pretty easily. But I just fell in love with the beauty of this, and I thought, especially being a marketing guy, what better tool would it be to become a popular farmer that somebody would want you to farm their ground than making just this beautiful portrait as people walk by? And then I started seeing all these ancillary benefits we were getting with the wheat. 2017 was a monsoon in our area, and we still do a lot of conventional farming. I wish we didn't, but we have a scenario where we're a family farm, and I just have not won that argument yet with Grandpa, and he's got the checkbook and kind of makes the rules. So it steers you so much the other direction when you start really seeing the problems with that mindset. We ended up replanting our corn a lot. This field was phenomenal, never stressed, because we had just so much better infiltration with that wheat. And when you start getting these 2, 3, 4-inch rains within an hour or two, it keeps that rain in the same location. So you're not getting this runoff to the low spots. It's infiltrating and it's taking care of weeds. We're expediting canopy closure about 3-4 weeks compared to a monocrop. So we can leverage that with lower herbicide earlier, and the crop just kind of takes care of itself. So the other cool thing is I started seeing what the soybeans did with that space, and it goes back to that Gary Coleman deal. Because we had all this new light introduced lower into the plant, it had no motive to go up, and it actually starts producing new leaves late in reproduction on those soybean plants. So as this matured, we had mature soybeans close to the stem, but we had these green leaves hold on forever because they were produced when it was relevant for that space later. And all that makes more nodes, but it drives the bean size up fantastically. And it makes a very sturdy bean plant, and everybody jokes, I hope you have a chainsaw when you cut them beans. Well, okay, yeah, it'll be all right. So there was tons of instances where we had 300, 400, 500 pods of these soybeans with space. Again, everyone wants this perfect perception, the picket fence, but the plant will compensate for it, whether it's wheat or soybeans. And I think we worry about that stuff too much. It's more important to just get that stuff out there. So this was the setup when we saw how that was behaving. Didn't cost much because I don't really have the freedom with these experiments. I self-fund all my experiments. So I have this mini farm of a 15-foot system. We're going to go to a 20-foot for next year to make all this work. So we already have the manure tanker. This Gandy box cost maybe $800 and some pipe. And we put this wheat seeder on the back and just hit the wheat on a little deflector triangle, and we try to get those wheat seeds right on the concave disc and drive fast enough to incorporate that in that soil to get seed to soil contact. What I would like to do in the future, and you'll see as we've experimented with these row schematics, is go to 20-40 inch corn, having that solar corridor to interseed our corn where we get the radish started a lot bigger, and then come in here and no-till in between that 20 right here and have that cover crop that's a lot bigger. That's the goal in the future.
Do you try to keep all your rows north and south? Take into account?
We just plan it the way that we've always farmed it. This one is a long, narrow field, so we went that way. But as you get wider, it becomes less relevant of that. I think Dave Hula said it would be advantageous of catching the afternoon sun on a hill. If you had a field like that, do everything to it because it's really efficient. But I found as we're going wider, it really doesn't matter too much. So I had a video in action. We pulled this about 12 miles an hour. And it was just 3 shanks. It was 5. We took off 2. But the idea, all of these ideas have a bigger dream, an ulterior motive, if you will. And I think somebody, if they wanted to pursue it, could put this on a Terragator or something like that with wings, make it 30, 40 foot tall, wide, and apply manure, apply seeds, have $10, $12 worth of seeds plus manure, and get in a crop share system with a neighbor utilizing resources they don't own. And even if our cost of goods are low, their revenue is going to be higher, and both people could be happy. But we'll see where that goes. So this is the fall. This is our cover crop, and we were ice cold. We've been ice cold the last 2 falls. It's been really hard to get that robust cover crop like you saw the previous year. But that's the wheat coming up. You can see how thin it is. We did 2 different seeding rates. We had one at 18 pounds and one at 27 pounds. And we didn't really see much of a yield difference with those seeding because of that empowerment. But the cover crops die. So you have minions. You have all these minions. When you have 10 pounds of radishes, you have a lot of plants. And all of them are storing that nutrients, that flammable ammonium in their roots. And we get a much quicker green up. I showed that previous picture with the real green spots. that's not only the manure, but that's the decomposition of this cover crop. And it is amazing the earthworms that we get in this system. So I think a big part of this is decomposition feeding the next crop there. But anywhere where you have a radish, you'll have 3 or 4 earthworms just mowing down on that. And that really changes that porosity of the soil, having that living, big-rooted, thin wheat plus those cover crops makes a really good environment for the soybeans. So made an interplanter, 20-40 inch rows in between that, just put it on a 40-20, and this is kind of staged throughout the growing season. So you can see that I really like these pictures with the sunbeams. You can see that both plants are happy. We just don't have much cost there. We can really reduce these soybean populations omitting rows. We can get the wheat planted really cheap. And this is the beauty, I talked about it earlier, but having this living cover crop. So there's all kinds of theories here, but if you look at the supply and demand of water in your crops, the problem in the Midwest, why we are always replanting, is we have an abundance. When we get that spring thaw, we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting for our soils to dry out. So then we're introducing this seed and we're putting it in the ground, and when it rains, it's just so much water and it'll die. And infiltrated soils help, but this location of the living crop is continuously consuming this excess water, so it makes the supply and demand graph equal out a little bit. We have some consumption. We have a lot better infiltration, so the root hairs and the whole plant health is a lot better having this companion. But if you notice, you go outside today or yesterday and the sun's out, it might be 66 degrees. If you go out over the ocean there, the water's 48, you can feel that cold breeze. And these little microclimates is something that we can really leverage in this situation. So imagine what the old timers tell me all the time when I'm planting soybeans in March, 6 weeks before anybody else. You idiot, they're just going to come up and they're going to die. Well, we get this thermal equity with that living plant. We get this kind of eagle's wing, if you will. So if we get a temperature, let's just make up a temperature of 27 degrees. If you look at your phone, it says 27 degrees. That's your 2-meter temperature. That's your nose. It's an algorithm here. So if we have enough warmth to trigger that soybean seed to come up and emerge, and as cotyledon opens up and that fluffy leaf comes out, that's when that soybean is susceptible for a killing frost. But in that time period, the wheat has grown. So we have this local manure that helps, but it's catching sun. So it's going from a plant like this to this, and it's growing out sideways. So it ends up tucking and getting right underneath the eagle's wing. So we've warmed up the soil because we can allow that to warm up. So if we're 27 degrees right here, it might be 37 in that little microclimate right there. It might be 32, 4 inches to the right. But going out in your fields, when you have a killing frost at a low spot where I saw the last year, and I cross-planted it, I saw that the only thing that died was the couple plants in the center. And the plants right next to the wheat stayed alive. So that got me thinking, if we tuck it like this, we can get new light on the inside and we can protect it from frost. So we can really push our planting date utilizing not only the water distraction, but that thermal equity. And I think there's a lot of applications that we could do in this, wider row mentality. Just have this thing do a lot of your dirty jobs. So this is about 10 days before harvest. When it starts turning yellow, I get really excited. I make a lot of Twitter videos. I get a lot of likes, a lot of retweets. It's magic, and it's just so cool walking out there. I don't know. Can you tell I just really dig this stuff? So you can see it's growing. It keeps growing. Get back here. So we put out our field signs. We had anywhere from a 2.8 to a 4.8. In our latitude, we grow a lot of 3.2, 3.4, 3.6 maturity beans. So we were really testing that maturity to see that relationship. And we had the same schematic behind the relay plot in the same varieties to see what the yield tax was of the wheat. Believe it or not, every variety except for one was better with the wheat than without it, and it was operator error. It was my first pass when I harvested it. I broke off too many stems, and that's what really set it back. But the wheat actually helped yield here. So we had the plot there for my field day. Then we had a bigger field here, and we actually cross-planted it to compare and contrast. And another good thing about the kind of the sloppy job that we did harvesting, we probably had maybe a harvest loss of 3 or 5 bushels, quite a bit. But that was our cover crop. If the wheat's $5, you can either seed it or you can empower the volunteer. And that was a pretty neat picture there. So as far as harvesting, we have an S680 with a 40-foot head, but I really wanted to pull it off agronomically. So my grandpa says it's my combine, my rules. That's kind of his tax break. So he buys the combine knowing that we can't shut him down even if he stays alive till he's 114. He's going to run that combine. So I just bought my own. And that's kind of my experimental combine. So we got a little 15-foot head just because with our guidance, it's not RTK sub-inch. So we mirrored that manure tanker and made a 3-row wheat combiner. And these are called FlexiFinger Flex Selects. And they snap on to the grain head on the knife. And it's really cool because you can think of any schematic possible and it's totally adjustable. So we had to adjust this way ahead of the reel. As we started, we were beating them beans up with the reel, and we had to really modify that to make it work. So I'll let this play out. This was at our field day, and I had Purdue University do a study on this, and they came out and made a drone video every 10 days throughout the growing season. But they were out here at the field day, and this is pretty neat. They'll go over the top, and you can really get a sense of what's happening here. So we're playing the limbo. My parents had dropped me off at the skating rink when I was little, and all them girls could go down there, and we're just basically compressing that soybean over. And it took a few hours to pop back up, but you'll see it over the top here. So we're utilizing the structuralness of the wheat to compress the soybean down. We took you see a little bit of green material in there. But that wheat crop that was a net negative compared to hiring a drag line, putting all that reduced seed, reduced cost, yielded 32 bushels, which is a lot less than what we're accustomed to. But as you start stacking these enterprises, it's not like we have to pay all of our load with one enterprise or one variable. It's all contribution margin. So if we have a reduced cost, it's actually cheaper than applying it manure, and we can get a contribution margin of $150 or something like that. And then start taking cost away from soybean production because we have less herbicide. We're managing our water. We're kind of reducing our risk. We're taking some of the variable risk out of the way. Then as a system, it's really incredible the profit margin of these relay cropping systems. But first, you just have to get over this mindset that both crops need to produce the same yield with the same steps, with multiple nitrogen passes. If you're willing, if you only have a contribution margin break even of 12 bushels or something astronomically low, why apply a fungicide? Why add any more nitrogen? Even if it could maybe add yield by applying inputs, if I keep the plant health up on the wheat and harvest delays me, 3 days with more moisture and takes up more sunlight, and it hurts the other crop, then it's just, it's just wasted money. So it's really cool when you start having these things introduced that don't cost any much, and you just let it happen.
What if you would have had poor weather conditions as far as rain for a couple of weeks? I guess how long is your window to make this work until it would just turn into?
Great question. That was the beauty of this year. We had the driest in our area from mid-April to mid-June, the driest in 120 years. We had less than an inch of rainfall. It just didn't rain. It's all a spectrum. Everything is a spectrum. So if we actually help when we do get rain, keep it in place and infiltrate, we're burning, moisture from past October because we're so cold. It's in the freezer and we preserve a lot of moisture. It's rare when I was a landscaper that we would ever have dry turf until maybe the third week of June. So by reducing the seed population, getting bigger roots, and not having a lot of plants in ultra wide rows, we're not hogging the whole thing. So think of a dimmer switch. When we're all the way to the left, we're not taking much at all. So you just have to accept the lower yield, help with these ancillary benefits, and the worst case, least rain in 100 years, it still didn't hurt the soybeans. They like it dry.
So you got your wheat crop in on the cheap. I guess the absolute worst case scenario that would happen is you couldn't get in there to harvest your wheat. The weeds are lost, and you go in there, you can still harvest your soybeans.
Yeah, and if you had a Romo or something like that, you could go in there and chop it up, and it's your cover crop if you didn't want to take it in there. Yeah, for a gross acre. So it goes back to that elasticity. I like economic terms for some reason. So imagine, two gas stations directly across the road from each other, and this one jacks up the price a dime. The elasticity of demand is extremely sharp right there. They'll say, screw you, I'm not paying another 10 cents for gas. I'll go over here. Well, in plants' capability to flex, elasticity is so sharp. When you go back to that corn, you might raise 200 bushel corn with, 35,000, maybe even 22,000. But if you plant 1/6 of that, you might get 130 bushel corn. So this intercropping allows you to leverage that elasticity in the graph. And you get a feel for that spectrum. You don't take all the water. You start managing the resources. Its corpse has a value. So you're thinking more in time and space and tax. So if I do things to empower the wheat, and it hurts the other thing, I've already made that statement, but you see how it all kind of all works together there. We don't check that out in our area. I do not know that. There was another video there. This was the 4.8 soybeans, and they pretty much consumed the wheat. They were almost shut back, so I had to go in there and get it out. It was really white knuckle driving there.
And the green material didn't an issue.
We were the elevator ourselves. We had another 100-acre field, and it got 90 and windy, and it dried down to like 11.5. So we put the wet stuff in a grain cart and just did a 7-layer casserole, and we got it down to 14 and played their own game, And that's something you can do, when you're trying out. This is the bigger field, and it's pretty cool when you do these things. You actually stripe it. You can see the solar stripes there. And this is a picture for later, but that's me harvesting the corn and the soybeans and the corn and the cover crop using a grain head with the same mentality of protecting that intercrop. So here's the power play. Solar corridors, and it's magic. This space, when you look to the right of the soybean, we're trying to make two 5s, two 1.68s, two arches. So that two rows forms, and that part of 5 that comes back, that's the grass growing underneath the tree. That's the floor. So we drive light down to each plant. Has one side, has nodes on each side that are like, wow, we have sunshine. And they had been in the shade, and now they're empowered. And you basically, instead of, with the way a soybean plant, it doesn't matter if it's a weed, if it's an eagle, if it's another soybean plant, if it's wheat, it's all competition for light. And that pruning, instead of the plant being in competition from each other and having to grow vertically and only getting a couple leaves to drive that whole plant, you're empowering all the leaves. So instead of just working on 2 or 3 nodes, you're working on 22, 25 of them at the same time. It's a power play, and it changes the architecture of the plant. I'll have a picture of this bean, and you'll see the pinch point, and you'll see how it changed. It has no motive to go up. It wants to fill in that space. It'll start growing new leaves to cover that space, and your nodes compress, the stalk gets thicker, and now you have the capability of, if it rains and stays sunny, just having incredible yields. So the beans they kept growing, they got taller than the kids, and you can see here how that light's getting down, and you can see kind of the freshness of those leaves. They'll grow kind of tiny leaves there, and it's just weird how a plant will grow things. We've been taught in our textbooks that all this stuff, corn makes up its mind at V2 and how many things it's going to do here and there. The plant's always changing its mind to its environment. And we saw that, with those earlier experiments. So that was a video of me going into that old wheat residue. And again, you had the fodder with the cover crop. The worms migrate to the decaying wheat roots. So not only do you have this pruning aspect, do you have the water consumption, you have the expedited canopy closure, but now you've pressed the residue down, you get a little bit of a reflection off of that straw, but when that carbon is decomposing, you're just really empowering biological activity in between those soybean rows. So you're getting a lot of your soybean roots to not only go into that manure, but it's going into manure that's had, what's the company that translates Chinese into English? What is that? Google, there you go. It's making those nutrients plant available. So it's just incredible energy. So this is a plant, I think this was a 4-6, and you can see its bend point. See where it bends? Look how condensed those nodes are. If we grow full season soybeans in our area, they always fall down because they're in vegetative, really long, in our long, warm days, and they get about this tall, and they won't yield as much. For some reason, our sweet spot is an area where we can get bloom 3 weeks before summer solstice more than the fuller season beans. But we had an inverse relationship with our fuller season in the relay because we introduced that light, so we changed its motive. So the competition actually triggers blooms a few days earlier. The plant will sense competition, it'll start blooming. So using a later maturity bean, changing its architecture and increasing the reproductive time, we started getting 30 noted soybeans. 160, 180% more than monocrops, kind of on this prune play. That's exciting. That's really cool when you're going out here and you're seeing these things happening. So this is one. We still had 3 varieties to go here. I thought we were going to get to 100, and we had 7 varieties go over 100 with a peak at 108 point something, which broke my previous soybean record of 107.47, which was monocrop soybeans. So I did this plot to see the tax of the wheat, but it actually helped because we compromised and thought more system and saw these ancillary benefits. And I really think if you think of this dimmer switch of this spectrum of these doing dirty jobs, we might make not only our cash crop or our cover crop give us ancillary benefits, but maybe it pays you back. pretty cool. So here's a picture of the, am I over time? Oh, okay, sorry. There's our corn and soybeans. The way that that panned out, the corn made about 130, the beans about 35. They were just too stretchy and didn't get enough light. But that guy from Virginia is going to come out with the staggered plants. He's got a patent pending on a seed disc through Precision, and he wants to put that plot out, and that'll be really interesting in that space idea, and there'll be a lot that we can go off on that. So that's me harvesting the corn. There's the beans afterwards. Our higher management, high yield plot, we did skip rows and got comparable yields, giving up a little bit of time to empower leaves on the corn. We did that this year. And then this is me harvesting that corn in the huge pearl millet that we had the intentions to graze. And that was pretty neat. Kids had a lot of fun out in that field. We called it the jungle.
And what do you guys do after combine?
We actually baled it. We got 9 inches of rain. It was just too wet, so we let it dry and cut it and baled it. This is the way that I feel. There's a lot of these ideas. I'm just a machine gun of, this conference has been awesome because there's so many ideas. There's no answers. Anything that we do is going to affect everything else. So just keep trying things. If you have an idea, just, if you think hot water will kill a weed, just put some water on the stove and boil it and see if it works. I mean, it takes the smallest experiment. And these things you can scale every year, and you get so diversified on these ideas. And, we're all young at heart. Just have fun with it. But thanks for your time. Any questions?
Does your cover crop provide your pest control, or do you do sprays as well?
I do both. So this past year, I called it the ultra low input. Mm-hmm. We added nothing other than a herbicide application, and we did fungicide that one time. And then the other one, with the high yield, we had multiple foliar feeds, and we just kind of went for the record to see what the difference was. And we do see quite a bit of ROI through timely agronomy, but I want to get away from it. And there's a lot more money, into this organic, and if we can figure out systems that will do jobs, and we can increase, the price of that commodity, and then maybe start direct marketing, then who cares about yield?
Are you thinking about diversifying the cover crop, having greater variety within there? Yes.
There's so many ideas there. I want to get into a rhizomious pasture, whether it be alfalfa and clover, and start. I really like that hot water idea, like doing these zones. One thing I ran out of time, but we're going to do a chicken tractor experiment this year, and put. We're going to probably frost seed some clover and get some annual ryegrass, and we're actually going to have hoses reels to chicken tractors on rollers, and they're going to be our little Roomba. And if we can figure out how to keep the chickens happy and wide and manage that biomass, then I want to try. We're going to have a little funny farm. We're going to have chicken tractors. We're going to have sheep with helmets on. I'll come up with more ideas, but I want multiple species and get a feel for how they can manage that.
Jason, will you do us a favor? Keep us posted on the AgEmerge community what you're doing, and then we'll copy the crazy in other places.
Okay.
And then we'll come up with our own sort of crazy and send it your way. How's that sound?
All right.
So awesome. Let's give Jason a hand. That was fantastic.
Thank you.